Now, winning and establishing frames is all well and good until you encounter the dreaded bull. You get a customer who is decisive, who is in your face, and who has a really big sales shield. They may as well have a neon sign on their head that says, "Piss off." You're gonna get those, and they're gonna happen a lot more often than people realize. But if you only get good at dealing with people who are kind and easygoing from the outset, you're literally saying no to a third of your potential sales. So how do we do what we call cracking these bulls? How do we crack them? How do we get them more amicable, easier going, easier to chat with? Well, it's simple. It's like a last resort. You use it, what's called a label. Well, what is labeling? It's very simple. You simply put a verbal label on the emotion that the customer is giving you. It can be something as simple as, "Hey, it seems like you don't like me." Or it can be something a little bit more specific where let's say you're doing face-to-face and maybe you're in a shopping center and you say, and you're in an area and you know that there's been lots of kiosk salesmen there for the last month. So, "Hey, look, I can tell you probably got a lot of people. I can't stand them either," right? And so now I'm labeling, I'm acknowledging that they don't want to speak to me, and all of a sudden, that emotion is nullified. Well, how does it work? Well, the first part about labeling is what you're really doing. You're helping a customer uncover their motives. What do I mean by that? Well, sometimes they will be acting in a way that's incongruent with who they see themselves as. If there's someone who considers themselves composed and you label that they're showing some sort of anger or negative emotion, very quickly they'll reset themselves into who they need to be. If their intention is not to make you feel unhappy, well, if you establish a label where you say, "Oh, it's like not necessarily outwardly saying, 'Are you trying to make me feel bad?' but saying, 'Hey, it seems like you don't really like me that much.'" Something as simple as that makes them go, "Oh, no, no, no." And then a lot of times they'll explain themselves. They'll say something like, "Oh, no, 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 sorry, it's just I get sold to by a lot of people." Or let's say you got someone at a car yard and they come in and you say, "Hey, you're looking at," "Nah, mate, just browsing. The missus just wants to have a look," right? Or, "Oh, yeah, my husband's just looking at cars, but we're not going to get anything." Being able to establish, "Hey, well, look, it seems like you're pretty frustrated by that." Well, even being able to open that dialogue, you're helping them feel more understood. So you're helping them find their intentions, and using their intentions, now you're navigating to an easier, better situation to be conversing with. Now, the next part of labeling and really understanding the power of getting someone to talk through their emotions, as simple as it may seem, especially as trivial as it seems in a sales pitch, you're really going to get a great lesson on how brains work. So this is actually pretty fantastic. So just hang with me. This is going to be a lot to digest. I promise I'm not going to be quizzing you on this kind of stuff, but it's really powerful for you to understand. How does the brain work? Well, the human brain has 3 layers. You have what's called your reptilian brain, which is your cerebellum and your brainstem. This is responsible for all your autonomic stuff, so like your breathing, how you process food, the stuff that you do without thinking. Then underneath that, you've got what's called your limbic system, otherwise known as your mammalian brain. It's something that most tribal animals have, right? Most tribal animals develop in herds, and emotions are designed to be able to convey and converse the way that we're feeling within the tribe. So this includes things like your amygdala, your hippocampus, and your hypothalamus, right? And this is this part here. So this is all underneath everything. This is all our subconscious. Have you ever just been feeling weird and have no reason to explain it? It's because something's in your limbic system. It hasn't come into the part of your brain that actually processes things. Then you've got your outer layer, which is called your cortex. This is the thing that humans have that most other animals don't, right? And right at the very front of it, that's where we have our ability to think through consequences, have impulse control, have intuition and empathy. Prefrontal cortex functions are what make us us in the frontal lobe of your brain. Now, that's just a really basic idea of how the brain works. I've done a lot of study on this. I find this kind of stuff fascinating. But within that, so in your limbic system, this is where you feel your emotions. This is where you think your thoughts. This is where you feel your emotions, right? And the problem with that is at the middle of your limbic system, you have what's called your hippocampus. This is the thing that lodges memories. So if you've ever been blackout drunk before, when you're blackout drunk, it turns off your hippocampus. It stops memories from processing. That's why they don't exist to you. So again, this is pretty heavy duty stuff. But when we're talking about emotions, have you ever been talking to a friend about a problem and just being able to really explain the problem and how it makes you feel and all that just instantly made you feel better about it, right? And that's why when you bottle things up, you feel so bad. Well, I'm going to explain that whole concept, right? When you haven't thought something through properly and really experienced it properly, your problem and the memory of it will stay lodged in your limbic system. It will stay in your emotional control center without giving it any sense of time. That's because the hippocampus is also responsible for how you perceive time, right? And so this is really important. Once you really integrate a memory, once something becomes a memory, the actual process, it'll happen to you, and then it'll go into your limbic system, so you'll experience it from your emotional side first. Then, let's say, here we go, left brain here, right? And then we've got our right brain over here. Our right brain is responsible for what's called our autobiographical memory. Our left brain is responsible for what's called our factual memory. And to wholly integrate something as something that happened and not something that is continually happening, we have to process something from the limbic system into the hippocampus, into the autobiographic memory, and then into the factual memory. So what do I mean by those two things? Well, autobiographical memory and factual memory would be something like, I broke my arm in 2002. So you see that's a fact. Whereas the autobiographical memory would be something more experiential, where you say, well, yeah, it was 2002, I was jumping on this trampoline and I slipped out, and all of a sudden I hit the ground and I just felt this searing pain come through my arm, and I looked at my arm and all of a sudden you're talking about the experiences. Well, this process, this can happen in milliseconds. And so if a customer that you're dealing with is showing some sort of negative emotion, when you label it, not only does it uncover their motives, but it actually draws out how they're feeling, and then they can rationalize why it's feeling that way. But not to mention, we're also leaving it in the past. It's something that happened, not something that's happening. This is how post-traumatic stress disorder works, and PTSD. So PTSD, it's actually pretty heavy-duty stuff, and I certainly won't make light of it. But in really traumatic situations, when people are in, let's say, wars or abusive situations or things, their brain will actually shut off their ability to remember it in order to protect them. Now, shutting off that memory means that the memory stays in this limbic system with no perception of time. Right? Which is pretty crazy to think about. So that's why when they hear these triggers, let's say they get this trigger, let's say, they hear a helicopter outside, and all of a sudden they get what's called a flashback, and they're hiding under a bed with a broomstick as a mop or whatever it may be. I know this sounds really awful. It's because their brain is still believing that it's still happening to them. So when you can draw it out through the hippocampus and then out into the right brain for the autobiographic memory, and then into the left brain for the factual memory, now all of a sudden it is something that happened and not something that is happening. The problem with curing PTSD, obviously, is that when you're talking about it with someone, they will immediately tense up and they won't want to talk it. So the real skill to coaching people through that is actually being able to keep them calm and make them feel safe. But 90% of what psychologists do when they have psychologist appointments, they get people to talk about what's happened, how it makes them feel, and they take things through this process, and it wipes the slate clean. Now, I know what you're thinking. What does this have to do with labeling? What does this have to do with sales? It's pretty cool, it's pretty interesting stuff, but how does it apply? It's when you label that emotion of what they're feeling, it now becomes something that happened, and now it becomes something that's in the past. So when I say, oh, look, it seems like you don't like me, right away, that distaste is gone, because it's like, oh, okay, well, that's happening. And I go, oh, well, no. Let me rephrase this for you. It's not because you don't like me. It's not because I don't like you. It's because I've had bad experiences with X, Y, Z. And now all you simply have to do is place yourself in a different place. Well, look, don't worry. I can't stand those people either, but what I'm doing today is important. And that is why labeling works from a psychological perspective. Cool stuff, right? Now, the last part about winning a good frame with a customer, who, especially those who are a little bit chillier or a little bit less likely to want you to pitch them, right, is really using what we talked about before, identity questions. Using people's perceived identity of themselves to hold them congruent to who they say they are. So it can be something really simple. So it's like, are you somebody who? So let's say I'm selling technology, right? And I'm selling them a piece of technology that will save them an extra 10 hours a week. And so I say, are you someone who values your time? Or let's say I'm selling an outdoors camping experience. Like, are you somebody who really likes to really experience nature? So holding people to that is a really powerful way to get them back on track. So if I'm labeling even, I can put them in conjunction and stack. I can say, look, it seems like you don't like me, or it seems like you don't like, X, Y, Z people like me, something, whatever it might be. And they say, oh, no, it's not that, it's just this, this, and this. It's like, that's okay, totally hear where you're coming from. Look, don't worry, I can't stand people like that either. But if you don't mind me asking, are you somebody who X, Y, Z? Right? Being able to hold people accountable to their identity is such a powerful way to redirect the conversation, because under no circumstance do people want to be what's called incongruent. Nobody wants to be a hypocrite. That's because our sense of identity is deeply rooted in where we place ourselves in social dominance hierarchies, where we place ourselves amidst people and how we fit in various tribes. Who we say we are is really important. That's why, if you counter somebody on their identity, it can often end in disaster. That's why political arguments are so heated these days, because so many people align who they are with their political values, and they can be sanctimonious about my morals are better than your morals. And it's so important for them to feel important that when you challenge their views on something, you're challenging their worth. People really tie themselves in with their identity. So asking questions that hold people accountable to their identity is a really powerful way to redirect a sale to make sure that people will give you the time of day.